In the vast graveyard of warships that litter the Pacific floor, few died as violently or as famously as the Japanese cruiser Mikuma. This wasn't just the death of a ship. It was the story of a flawed masterpiece, a vessel born from deception that was ultimately undone not by enemy genius, but by a single catastrophic mistake in the dark, leading to one of the most brutal takedowns in naval history. Part 1. A deceptive design. To understand the Mikuma, you have to understand the world she was born into. The year is 1930. The great naval powers of the world, still haunted by the sheer industrial slaughter of the First World War, were desperately trying to prevent the next one by limiting the size of their navies. Through a series of agreements, like the Washington and London naval treaties, they put strict caps on how many battleships and heavy cruisers a nation could build. A heavy cruiser was defined by its main armament, guns with a caliber of up to 8 inches or 203 millimeters. Anything with smaller guns, specifically 6.1 inches or 155 millimeters, was classified as a light cruiser, and nations could build more of them. Now, most nations looked at this treaty and saw a set of rules to be followed. The Imperial Japanese Navy, however, looked at it and saw a puzzle to be solved. They were convinced that a future war with the United States was not just possible, but inevitable. And in that war, they knew they would be outnumbered. Their solution was not to build within the rules, but to build around them. Their answer to this puzzle was the mogami-class of cruisers. On paper, these were perfectly legal light cruisers. They were slated to carry 15 155mm guns and 5 triple turrets, a fearsome broadside for any ship in its class. But this was a carefully constructed lie. From the very first blueprint, the mogami-class was a sham. The ship's designers and engineers were given a secret, almost impossible task: build a light cruiser that could, with minimal effort, be transformed into a heavy cruiser. The entire structure, the barbettes that held the turrets, the ammunition hoists, and the support systems were all designed and reinforced to handle the immense weight and recoil of much larger 203mm twin turrets. The plan was simple: build the ships as light cruisers to satisfy the treaty, and when war inevitably broke out, they would sneak them back into the shipyards, swap out the turrets, and suddenly unveil a new squadron of powerful heavy cruisers that their enemies didn't even know existed. It was a brilliant, audacious piece of strategic deception. The Mikuma was the second ship of this revolutionary class. Laid down in December 1931 at the Mitsubishi shipyards in Nagasaki, she was a true marvel of modern engineering. She stretched over 660 feet long, displaced over 13,000 tons at full load, and her powerful turbines could push her through the water at a blistering 35 knots, fast enough to outrun almost any battleship and keep pace with destroyers. She was armed to the teeth not just with her main guns, but with a heavy anti-aircraft battery and, most importantly, a devastating array of Type 93 torpedoes. These were the infamous Long Lance torpedoes, arguably the best naval torpedoes of World War II. They were oxygen-propelled, incredibly fast, had a massive warhead, and left almost no wake, making them nearly impossible to spot and avoid. The Mikuma carried a dozen of these ship killers. But brilliance often comes at a cost. In their quest to cram so much firepower and speed onto a treaty-compliant hull, the designers had pushed the limits of naval architecture too far. The first ship of the class, the Mogami, revealed serious problems during her sea trials. The ships were dangerously top-heavy. Their hulls were structurally weak due to experimental welding techniques, and the recoil from firing a full broadside literally warped the ship's frame. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The Imperial Japanese Navy had to pull the first two ships, Mogami and Mikuma, back for an emergency and incredibly expensive refit. They were fitted with anti-torpedo bulges to improve stability, and their hulls were extensively reinforced. The fixes worked, but they were a clear sign that these ships, for all their power, were built on a knife's edge. By 1939, with the naval treaties crumbling and war on the horizon, Japan dropped the charade. Mikuma and her sisters went into dry dock and had their 155mm guns replaced with 10 203mm guns and 5 twin turrets, officially becoming the heavy cruisers they were always meant to be. The deception was complete. The hunter was ready. Part 2. The Hunter of the Southern Seas. When war finally erupted across the Pacific on December 7, 1941, Mikuma was more than ready. Assigned to Cruiser Division 7, alongside her sisters Mogami, Suzuya, and Kumano, she was at the sharp end of the Japanese spear. Her first taste of action came with the invasion of Malaya, where her powerful guns provided shore bombardment and her float planes conducted reconnaissance, paving the way for the Japanese Army's stunningly rapid advance down the peninsula towards Singapore. She played a similar role in the invasions of Borneo and Sumatra, her presence a constant, looming threat to any Allied naval forces in the area. But her crowning achievement, the moment that cemented her reputation as a deadly predator, came on the last night of February 1942, in the dark, chaotic waters of the Sunda Strait. Following the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea, the surviving Allied naval forces were in a desperate flight, trying to escape the closing Japanese trap. Two of these ships, the American heavy cruiser USS Houston and the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth, attempted to break out through the Sunda Strait, which separates the islands of Java and Sumatra. They had no idea they were sailing directly into the path of the main Japanese Western invasion fleet, which included the Mikuma and her sister ship Mogami. What followed was one of the most brutal, close-range naval brawls of the entire war. Just after 11 p.m., the two Allied cruisers, exhausted and low on ammunition, stumbled right into the Japanese fleet. The night exploded with star shells, searchlights, and gunfire. Houston and Perth fought with incredible courage, but they were hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. Mikuma and Mogami charged into the fray, their powerful searchlights pinning the Allied ships in stark white beams as their 8-inch guns roared. At one point, the range was so close it was practically point-blank. Mikuma alone fired nearly 200 main gun shells during the engagement. But the real killers that night were the torpedoes. In the chaos, the Japanese destroyers and cruisers, including Mikuma and Mogami, unleashed a biblical swarm of 87 long-lance torpedoes. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. While many found their mark on the Houston and Perth, tearing them apart and sending them to the bottom, many others missed and ran wild straight into the Japanese invasion fleet they were supposed to be protecting. In a spectacular display of friendly fire, Japanese torpedoes sank a minesweeper and 4 of their own troop transports, including the one carrying the commander of the 16th Army, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. He was forced to abandon ship and spent a good while swimming in the oil-slicked water. You can just imagine the awkward after-action report for that one. Despite the self-inflicted damage, the battle was a decisive Japanese victory. Both Allied cruisers were sunk with heavy loss of life, and the last significant Allied naval threat in the region was eliminated. The Mikuma had drawn first blood, and she had proven herself to be every bit the powerful warship her designers had intended. With a string of victories under her belt, the Mikuma steamed towards her next objective, a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific called Midway. She was at the peak of her power, entirely unaware she was sailing towards a catastrophe of her own making that would seal her fate long before the first enemy bomb fell. Part 3. The Midway Catastrophe. The Japanese plan for the Battle of Midway was a masterpiece of complexity. It was a sprawling, multi-pronged operation involving virtually the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, designed to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where it could be annihilated. Mikuma and the rest of Cruiser Division 7, commanded by Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita, were part of the invasion force. Their primary mission was to provide heavy fire support for the troops landing on Midway Atoll itself. It was a role they had performed flawlessly before, and there was no reason to believe this time would be any different. The Japanese High Command was radiating confidence. The victory disease, as it was later called, was in full swing. On June 4, 1942, the battle began, but it did not go according to plan. In a stunning and brutal 5 minutes that morning, American dive bombers from the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown found the Japanese carrier fleet and changed the course of the war. 3 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into raging infernos. A 4th, the Hiryu, would be sunk later that day. The heart of the Japanese fleet had been ripped out. News of the disaster threw the Japanese command into chaos. In a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered Admiral Kurita to take Cruiser Division 7 and conduct a high-speed run to Midway to bombard the island's defenses at night. This was a hugely risky move. Without air cover, they would be incredibly vulnerable to American air attacks come sunrise. But it was the only offensive move they had left. Kurita's 4 heavy cruisers, Kumano, Suzuya, Mikuma, and Mogami, pushed their engines to the limit and raced through the darkness towards the island. Then, shortly after midnight, disaster struck. A lookout on the flagship Kumano spotted an object in the dark water ahead. It was the American submarine USS Tambor. The submarine skipper, Lieutenant Commander John Murphy, had also spotted the Japanese ships but was struggling to identify them and get into an attack position. On the Japanese flagship, Admiral Kurita saw the submarine as an immediate threat. He flashed a red warning light and ordered an emergency 45-degree turn to port to avoid a potential torpedo attack. Put yourself on that bridge for a second. In the pitch black, an enemy submarine is spotted. What do? Sound the alarm? Order a hard turn? Every second counts, and hesitation can be fatal. Kurita's order was instinctive, but it was a fatal one. The ships behind him in the column reacted instantly, but in the darkness and confusion, things went horribly wrong. The flagship Kumano turned sharply, followed by the Suzuya. But the 3rd ship in line, the Mikuma, had misinterpreted the signal and made a much wider turn. The last ship, the Mogami, had turned correctly. The result was that the Mogami's bow was now aimed directly at the middle of the Mikuma. At nearly 30 knots, the 13,000-ton Mogami slammed violently into her sister ship's port side, just aft of the bridge. The collision was catastrophic. The Mogami's bow was completely crushed, bent back on itself almost to a 90-degree angle. She was crippled, her speed reduced to a crawl. The Mikuma, however, seemed to have gotten off lightly at first. The initial impact had ruptured her port-side fuel tanks, and she was now bleeding a thick black trail of oil into the sea. But her engines and rudder were still intact. She could still make good speed. The squadron commander ordered Mikuma and Mogami to retire from the area, while the 2 undamaged cruisers continued on towards Midway. But the bombardment was soon cancelled, and the entire Japanese fleet was ordered to retreat. The 2 wounded sisters were left behind, leaking a trail of oil that was, in effect, a giant arrow pointing directly at them for any American pilot to follow. Their fate was now sealed. Part 4, The Longest Day, the Final Battle. As the sun rose on June 5th, the 2 crippled cruisers were alone, struggling to make their way west and escape the ever-expanding search radius of American air power. They were not alone for long. Their oil slick was spotted by a PBY Catalina search plane, and their position was radioed back to Midway. The first to attack were the last remnants of Midway's own Air Force. A flight of 6 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and 6 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off to find them. The B-17s, bombing from high altitude, missed completely, as they so often did against maneuvering ships. The Dauntlesses pressed home their attack, but the heavy anti-aircraft fire from the 2 cruisers was intense and accurate. They scored no direct hits. A second attack group from Midway, this time composed of obsolete Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, fared no better. During this attack, Captain Richard E. Fleming, a Marine Corps pilot, pressed his attack so low through the hail of flak that his plane was set on fire. Trailing smoke and flames, he continued his dive and dropped his bomb before crashing into the sea. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his incredible bravery. For the rest of June 5th, the 2 ships were left alone. They must have thought they had a chance, that they might just limp out of range and make it back to the main fleet. They were wrong. The American carrier commanders, Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, had spent the day making sure the Japanese carrier fleet was truly finished. But on the morning of June 6, Having refueled their destroyers, they turned their full attention to the two lagging cruisers. It was time to finish the job. The first wave came from the USS Hornet, 31 Dauntless dive bombers, 8 Wildcat fighters, and 8 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The Avenger's torpedoes all missed, but the dive bombers were brutally effective. They concentrated on the already heavily damaged Mogami, scoring 2 direct hits, but the Mikuma was not ignored. A bomb struck her number 4 turret, killing the entire gun crew. The 2 ships were now battered, but still fighting. Then came the second wave, this time from the USS Enterprise. The dive bombers of Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6, the same pilots who had wrecked the Kaga and Akagi 2 days earlier, now descended on the Mikuma. At around noon, they began their dives. The sky over the Japanese cruiser became a whirlwind of screaming engines, tracer fire, and explosions. The Mikuma put up a valiant defense, her anti-aircraft guns blazing, but she was a large, slow-moving target. The American pilots were experts, and they placed their bombs with chilling precision. One bomb hit her forward turret. Another slammed into her bridge, though it failed to detonate. A third struck near her floatplane deck, starting a large fire. But the 2 fatal blows came amidships. 2 1,000-pound bombs plunged through her decks right above the engine rooms. One of them, or perhaps a secondary explosion from the fires it started, found the absolute worst possible place on the ship, the torpedo room. The Mikuma's prized long-lance torpedoes, with their volatile oxygen flasks and massive warheads, began to cook off. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. A gigantic fireball erupted from the center of the ship, tearing a huge hole in her side and ripping through the decks. The blast was so powerful it vaporized a large section of the superstructure and sent a plume of fire and smoke thousands of feet into the air. And this, in my opinion, was the moment the ship truly died. The bombs were just the funeral pyre. The Mikuma was now a floating inferno, her back broken, her engines dead, and her crew being incinerated by the uncontrollable fires. Even then, the attacks continued. A third wave, this time from the Hornet, arrived in the afternoon. They put at least 2 more bombs into the burning wreck and took some of the most dramatic and famous photographs of the entire war. The images are haunting. They show the Mikuma shrouded in smoke, her middle section a chaotic ruin of twisted metal. Her forward guns are askew, her aft turrets are pointing at the sky, and you can clearly see the empty torpedo tubes, their deadly contents having just blown the ship apart from the inside. Captain Shakao Sakayama, though gravely wounded, gave the order to abandon ship. The Mogami, despite her own horrific damage, came alongside to rescue the survivors, pulling men directly from the burning decks of the Mikuma. After rescuing as many as she could, the Mogami, with a U-boat alert forcing her to leave, fired a single torpedo into her sister's hull to hasten her end. It was a final, merciful act. But the Mikuma refused to die quickly. She burned throughout the evening, a solitary funeral pyre on the vast, empty ocean. Just as dusk fell, she finally gave up her fight, rolled over onto her port side, and slipped beneath the waves, taking over 700 of her crew with her. Part 5. Legacy of a Wreck. The sinking of the Japanese cruiser Mikuma was more than just the loss of another warship. It was a perfect, brutal microcosm of the entire Battle of Midway. It was a story that began with Japanese arrogance and a complex plan that left no room for error. It was a story defined by a single, catastrophic mistake, a panicked turn in the dark that led to a collision between sisters. And it was a story that ended with the awesome and terrifying power of American carrier-based aviation. The loss was a blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy, but the intelligence gained by the Americans was almost as valuable. The photographs taken by the Hornet's pilots provided the U.S. Navy with its first clear look at the new Mogami-class cruisers and their equipment. They analyzed the turrets, the fire control systems, and the damage, giving them crucial insights into Japanese warship design and vulnerabilities. For the crew, it was an unimaginable horror. Only about 240 men survived the sinking. The Mogami had picked up most of them, but 2 sailors were later rescued by the same American submarine, the USS Tabular, that had inadvertently caused the disaster in the first place. They became prisoners of war and provided even more intelligence to the Allies. Today, the Mikuma rests somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, her exact location still unknown. She is a war grave, a silent testament to the fury of the battle that raged above her. Her story is a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of naval warfare, where the line between hunter and hunted can be crossed in an instant, and where a single mistake can lead to total annihilation. So what's the lesson here? Never ram your sister? Well, yes, obviously. But more than that, the Mikuma teaches us that in war, even the most brilliant designs and the most powerful weapons are no match for chaos, chance, and the simple, brutal reality of a 1,000-pound bomb. The final, haunting images of her death are not just pictures of a sinking ship. They are a portrait of a turning point in history, a moment when the tide of war in the Pacific turned for good, captured in the tortured steel and billowing smoke of a once proud warship. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and death of the IJN Mikuma. The chaos of battle often comes down to single moments, single decisions that spiral into legend or disaster. The story of Mikuma is a powerful reminder that in the unforgiving environment of war, your deadliest enemy can sometimes be your own reflection in the dark waters. If you believe there's another naval blunder or a forgotten hero's stand that deserves the spotlight, drop your suggestion in the comments below. And to ensure you don't miss our next historical expedition, consider joining our fleet by hitting that subscribe button. It's the best way to support the channel without having to swim in oil-slicked water. We'll see you on the next one.